There are two communities on the Indian subcontinent that call themselves essentially the same word. In India, they're known as Siddhi. In Pakistan, separated by a modern border but sharing the same founding legend, the same religious identity, and the same claimed descent from enslaved East Africans brought across the Indian Ocean centuries ago, they're known as Sheedis. Ask either community where they come from, and you'll hear nearly identical answers. Bantu ancestors, the East African coast, the long maritime slave trade controlled by Arab and Swahili traders. What population geneticists eventually found, once they finally sequenced both populations using the same methodology, wasn't a confirmation of that shared story. It was a genetic gap wide enough to make you wonder whether the same word was ever really describing the same thing. The historical backbone connecting these two communities is genuinely substantial. From the 8th century onward, the Indian Ocean functioned as a major corridor for the trade of enslaved sub-Saharan Africans, moved along sea routes that Arab and Swahili merchants controlled for centuries, feeding captive populations into ports across the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. Communities descended from that trade formed in what is now Gujarat and Karnataka in India, and separately along the Makran coast of Balochistan and in Sindh in what is now Pakistan, concentrated today especially in Karachi's Liari district. Both communities trace their arrival through overlapping historical channels. Early Arab conquest-era soldiers, later waves brought by Portuguese traders beginning in the 16th century, and centuries of Indian Ocean maritime slaving that treated the entire coastline, regardless of which empire eventually claimed it, as a single interconnected labor market. Both groups are predominantly Muslim today. Both carry oral traditions describing Bantu East African origin. Both, remarkably, trace a shared connection to Malik Ambar, the Ethiopian-born statesman and military commander who rose from slavery to become the de facto ruler of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate in the early 1600s, claimed as an ancestral point of pride by Siddhi and Sheedi communities alike. Given that overlapping history, the same maritime trade system, the same broad time period, the same religious conversion, the same oral tradition of Bantu origin, you would reasonably expect population geneticists studying both communities to find broadly comparable African ancestry proportions. Two populations built from the same historical machine should, in principle, carry roughly similar genetic fingerprints of that machine's output. Before we get to the numbers themselves, it's worth sitting with how strong that expectation really is. This isn't a case of two communities with vaguely similar backstories that might turn out to be coincidental. Siddis and Sheedis share a name, a religion, a specific historical narrative down to particular details like the Malik Ambar connection, and a documented participation in the exact same transoceanic trade network. If shared history predicts shared genetics anywhere in this entire series, this should be the cleanest case for it. It isn't. A landmark 2017 genome-wide study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that Pakistan's Makrani Sheedis carry African ancestry of only approximately 12%, with a margin of roughly 7 percentage points either way. Compare that to genetic studies of India's Siddis, which have consistently found African ancestry in the range of 60 to 75%. That's not a modest discrepancy. It's a 4 to 6-fold difference between two populations that, on paper, share almost the entire origin story. Y chromosome data sharpens the gap even further. Only around 12% of Sheedi paternal lineages trace to Africa at all, with the majority instead carrying haplogroups associated with South Asian and Near Eastern populations, the exact genetic profile you'd expect from the surrounding Baloch and Sindhi population, not from Bantu East Africa. Here's a question worth sitting with before we explain it. If both communities were built from the same trade system, telling nearly identical stories about their own origins, why would one end up 5 or 6 times more genetically African than the other? The answer researchers landed on involves both scale and timing, and it reframes the entire comparison. Genetic modeling in the 2017 study dated the core admixture event in the Makrani Sheedi population to roughly 300 years ago during the period of Omani Empire dominance over Indian Ocean trade routes, a specific and comparatively recent window. And unlike India's Siddhi communities, which the same body of research suggests remained relatively isolated and endogamous for a much longer stretch of their history before recent intermarriage accelerated, the Pakistani Sheedi population appears to have adopted local marriage practices and intermarried with neighboring Baloch populations far more rapidly after that founding admixture event. Measured through genetic markers of parental relatedness that closely match the broader Pakistani population, rather than showing the kind of prolonged genetic isolation researchers found in India. If a comparison like this makes you want to check whether two communities you'd always assumed were basically interchangeable actually turn out to be genetically worlds apart, that's exactly the kind of gap this channel exists to hunt down. So go ahead and subscribe now, because next time we're taking that same instinct somewhere else entirely, to a pair of communities most viewers have never even thought to compare. And if you already know of two groups sharing a name or a legend that might not hold up once someone finally runs the numbers, tell us in the comments, because that's often exactly how this series finds its next subject. There's a smaller scale piece of supporting evidence worth mentioning too. A separate mitochondrial DNA study of the broader Makrani population, not limited to self-identified Sheedis specifically, found a maternal genetic pool that was itself heavily admixed, with African haplogroups making up only about 28% of maternal lineages, alongside substantial West Eurasian at 26% and South Asian contributions at 24%. Even on the maternal side, where slave trade era admixture in most parts of the world tends to concentrate more heavily, the Makrani signal comes out closer to a genuinely three-way blend than a population dominated by a single African source. Another data point reinforcing just how differently this specific corner of the Indian Ocean slave trade's legacy settled into the local gene pool compared to India. The story doesn't end with a simple lower percentage, though. Researchers studying the Makrani genome also went looking for evidence of natural selection acting on the African-derived genetic material that did arrive, and they found something specific and biologically significant. The African-associated Duffy null blood group variant, well known for conferring resistance to Plasmodium vivax, the malaria parasite dominant in South Asia, was introduced into the Pakistani gene pool through this same slave trade and shows clear evidence of having been actively favored by natural selection in the centuries since. In other words, even though the overall African genetic contribution to the Makrani population turned out to be far smaller than expected, the specific piece of that contribution offering a direct survival advantage against a locally endemic disease was retained and amplified anyway, a pattern this channel has now seen play out in different specific forms from Mexico to India to Pakistan. It's worth pausing on one more comparative wrinkle because it complicates the picture in an interesting direction rather than simplifying it. Not every Sheedi community in Pakistan shows identical results. Communities along the Makran coast itself, more directly tied to the historical ports where Omani-era slave ships would have docked, and communities further inland or more thoroughly integrated into Baloch tribal structures through generations of marriage, show measurable internal variation in African ancestry proportion, mirroring, on a smaller scale, the same island by island and community by community divergence this channel has now documented in populations from Brazil to Cape Verde. The 12% figure researchers cite is a population average, not a fixed number stamped uniformly across every Sheedi family in Sindh and Balochistan. Some individuals and family lines carry noticeably more African ancestry than the average, others noticeably less, a reminder that even within a single named community sharing one origin story, genetic history keeps refusing to flatten into a single tidy number. For Sheedi communities today, concentrated heavily in Karachi's Liari district as well as coastal areas of Sindh and Balochistan, this genetic history exists alongside a lived reality shaped far more by class and marginalization than by ancestry percentages. Liari has long been one of Karachi's most economically disadvantaged and, at times, most violence-affected neighborhoods, and Sheedi communities there have historically occupied working-class positions in fishing, security, and labor. Politically, the community has shown real influence, voting patterns that have shaped Sindh and Baloch nationalist politics for generations, even as broader Pakistani society has often treated Sheedi identity as marginal. Cultural continuity persists visibly through events like the annual Sheedi Mela, a festival centered on the Sufi shrine of Pir Mangho, celebrating African-rooted spiritual and musical traditions that have survived regardless of what any genetic percentage eventually turned out to say. The community's internal social structure also reflects a history distinct from India's Siddis in its own right. Sheedis in Pakistan organized themselves into 4 traditional clans, or houses: Karadar Makan, Hyderabad Makan, Lassi Makan, and Belaro Makan, a formal kinship framework that has helped preserve group identity even as intermarriage with surrounding Baloch and Sindhi populations diluted the genetic signal researchers eventually measured. It's also worth noting how this finding fits into a wider genetic map of the Indian Ocean slave trade that researchers have only recently started assembling in any real detail. The same 2017 study situates the Makrani admixture event within a broader pattern of Omani-controlled trade routes that moved enslaved East Africans not just toward Pakistan and India, but toward the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, and parts of the Swahili coast itself, each destination absorbing a different volume of arrivals over a different span of time, and each producing its own distinct genetic outcome as a result. Pakistan's Sheedi population, in this wider context, isn't an outlier so much as one data point in a slave trade whose genetic legacy turns out to be far more geographically uneven than the single, unified narrative of the Indian Ocean slave trade usually suggests. The same historical system that produced Sindhi communities carrying the highest African ancestry proportions documented anywhere in South Asia also produced, a few hundred miles west, a community whose African ancestry sits closer to what you'd find in parts of the Arabian Peninsula. One trade network, at least 2 very different genetic destinies, and likely several more still waiting for a research team to go looking. What this comparison ultimately demonstrates is something this series keeps circling back to from different angles. A shared name and a shared origin story are historical and cultural facts, not genetic predictions. Sindhi and Sheedi communities built their identities around the same maritime trade system, the same religious conversion, even the same specific historical figures, and none of that was false. But the actual genetic outcome of that shared history diverged sharply depending on exactly when the core admixture happened, how quickly local intermarriage followed it, and how isolated or integrated each community remained in the centuries afterward. 2 branches of what looks, from the outside, like a single historical story turned out to carry genomes different enough that a geneticist handed samples from both, with no other context, would likely never guess they were supposed to be telling the same tale. The name survived the crossing intact. The genome, it turns out, took a different route entirely.